At this time, I'd like for you to give a warm Wyoming welcome to Tracy Kidder.
I'm going to talk for a while, then I'm going to show you some pictures. And then if there's any time left, I'll try to answer your questions. I imagine maybe a few of you have read this book that I call Strength in What Remains. But if you have, I wonder if for a moment you could imagine that you're hearing the story for the first time in a taxi cab or on a train or something. The story goes like this. A young medical student named Deogracias Nizonquiza narrowly survived the onset of civil war in his native country, the small East Central African nation of Burundi. He survived because he left the door to his room open, and the men who would have killed him assumed that he had already escaped. He made a 6 months long escape on foot, first from the onset of Burundi's civil war, and unfortunately he went to Rwanda, escaping, and then another escape from the genocide in Rwanda. And then he came back to Burundi, and then almost by accident, he ended up getting transported to America. He landed at JFK with $200 in his pocket, a visa obtained under false pretenses. That's all been straightened out since then. No English, no friends or relations, and memories of horror so fresh that he sometimes confused past and present. His first trip on a subway in a New York City subway got lost for most of a day. He eked out a sort of living by delivering groceries in the Upper East Side, Manhattan, and at night he slept in Central Park, though that after living for a while in a crack house in Harlem, he found Central Park a great deal more salubrious. And then one day, sick and near despair, he delivered groceries to a small Upper East Side Catholic church, and where he met an ex-contemplative nun who spoke passable French and who decided that what he needed was a family. There isn't time for me to talk about this woman, and I wouldn't want to give her short shrift because I've never enjoyed writing about anyone more. Her name's Sharon McKenna. And she set out to find Dale a place in New York, and she kept on trying long after Dale began to wish that she would simply stop. Infuriating him at times and making him wonder if she didn't want him to have a family more than he actually wanted one. But she succeeded. He was essentially adopted by a childless American couple, a sociologist and an artist, neither young nor rich, but big-hearted and brave, obviously. And 2 years after landing at JFK under such unpromising circumstances, he was enrolled as an undergraduate at Columbia University. I was struck by this story. The first time I heard it, so struck that I spilled my water. By its drama, among other things, it opened up for me a sense of wonder. Having heard what Dale went through, I felt, or at least I hoped, that I would never again look at anonymous faces in quite the same way, especially the faces of people with foreign accents, janitors, hotel maids, taxi drivers, young men delivering groceries. Who are they really? What memories and dreams do they carry? What abilities that they may never get to use? But what drew me to Dale's story, first of all, what made me think I might like to write about this, was something rather small. Recounting his time of homelessness, he mentioned that before heading for bed in Central Park, he would look in all directions to make sure that no one was watching, because he figured that anyone who saw him entering the park at that hour would figure that he was homeless. And when he told me this story, I thought of my daughter, who, when she was a young teenager, went on a trip to New York City and began to cross a busy avenue against the light. My wife yelled at her, and when they got to the other side, she said to my wife, "Thanks a lot, Mom, for ruining my reputation in New York City." I knew this story of Dale's was true, and not just through my daughter. I could imagine myself in his place, fearing the eyes of strangers, not the darkness of the park and not what might happen to me when I surrendered myself to sleep there, but the pity or the disdain of strangers who would never be anything but strangers to me. And feeling this, I thought I could probably find a way into his story if he decided he was willing to let me tell it, as he eventually did decide. Some time back, someone told me that I was a purposive writer. By purposive, I think she meant writing that aims to expose and analyze problems and offer solutions. But somehow it seems important to say that I don't deserve that compliment. Some writers do, writers who understand that the world's recurring catastrophes, that grossly inequitable distribution of health, for instance, or events like civil war and genocide aren't accidents, but the products of socioeconomic and political structures, all of which have histories that can be unearthed. Those writers focus their books on large groups of people. They may pause now and then to describe individuals, but as a rule, they do this to talk about something they think is much more important, which is the fate of populations. I respect the motives that often lie behind that kind of work, to expose suffering, the hope of lessening it, for instance. I'm forever in the debt of people who write theoretically, but I have a hard time bending my own mind around generalizations. Often all I can think about are exceptions. To me, the sheer scale of the big subjects, subjects like genocide and war and epidemic disease, makes them incomprehensible through one approach alone. I don't think you could claim to understand an enormous event like the Great Depression in America just by reading about one fictional family's experiences in The Grapes of Wrath. But I also don't think you could make take in the enormity, the great evil of the Holocaust without reading at least one account of an individual life that was enmeshed in the Holocaust. For instance, in Primo Levi's great novel, The Periodic Table. Stories can be a window on enormity and enormousness, a means to borrow from the poet William Blake to see the world in a grain of sand. I think we're born with special equipment for telling and receiving stories. Stories are one way we organize the world's chaos and one way in which we pass that information on from generation to generation. The best stories are living monuments to memories that ought to be preserved, and they don't need any other justification. But other justifications do exist. I used to say that the most important thing for a writer of stories to do is to create life on the page, and then my editor of 40 years corrected me. He said the trick was to get life off the page and into the reader's imagination. And when that happens, readers are able to imagine other lives, including the lives of, including the suffering of others. Stories can create a road to sympathetic imagination, and true sympathy, I think, is just one of the ingredients for ameliorating suffering. Sorry, I've gotten off track. I was talking about storytelling, maybe because of all the Dickens my mother used to read me, and maybe by inclination, probably by deficiency. I understand the world best through stories. And because the engine of any story is human character, I've spent most of my years as a writer looking, first of all, not for subjects, but for characters. One of whom was a small-town cop, whom I first met because I was speeding. My wife also met him that day, and for the same reason. But he didn't give her a ticket. It turned out that he didn't usually give women tickets because he hated to see women cry. And when I found this out, I thought this guy might be interesting. There was a pair of old men in a nursing home room who were spending their time in that vestibule to eternity, doing something more interesting and more difficult than playing bingo, which was to make friends. It was a team of computer engineers trying to build a new machine, essentially against their company's wishes. I remember that my interest in those engineers quickened when one of the team took me aside and told me about what he called the wars. And he used all this martial language. There was blood on the floor, there were people who shot from the hip I think they all came from Wyoming. And as near as I can tell, he was talking about the creation of immobile plastic boxes. On one occasion, I did set out to find a person in a profession, an elementary school teacher, but once I found her in a grubby elementary school in a rundown Massachusetts mill town, what I set out to do was to tell the story of a year inside her classroom. If that story happened to reveal some general truths about the problems of public education in America, so much the better, I felt. But it would have been impossible, at least for me, to generalize that teacher and her class with them so vividly alive in front of me. I once wrote a book about the building of a house, menage a trois, without sexual connotations. My book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, really began when I ran into Dr. Paul Farmer by accident in Haiti, and Strength in What Remains began in much the same way when I met Deo Gracias on a visit to Paul Farmer. In both cases, I was interested in, initially not in the issues that interested those men, but in the outlines of their lives, which seemed eminently suited to storytelling. I probably shouldn't admit this, but what I aspire to is art. Art has the great power to transform the experience of suffering and injustice into something beautiful. And I think, others have said this, of course, that art is created with a certain obliviousness to commerce and also to didacticism. The great storyteller Jorge Luis Borges once said that if you're telling a story about time, the one word forbidden you is the word time. When you talk about a book you've written, you're expected quite legitimately to be able to say what it's about. But in this case, I find it easier to say what this book about Deo isn't about. The main thing it's not about is Africa, which is conceived by so many of us Americans as one vast dysfunctional country. And I know I didn't want to make Burundi seem exotic. I hope to make it comprehensible. We hear about mass slaughter in distant countries, and we imagine that murder and mayhem define those places. I hope that Deo's story would humanize our view of Burundi and also open up a part of New York City that is designed to be invisible, the service entrances of the Upper East Side, the camping sites that homeless people make in Central Park. Certainly, my book has to do with war and genocide, courage and endurance, the generosity of strangers, the uses and disuses of memory. But we already know the truths about those subjects, that war and genocide are deplorable, that human beings are capable of great resilience, that charity happens, that memory can be an ungovernable torment. What I wanted really was to allow readers to experience those facts, not as truisms, but as we experience them in our lives, to experience them again through Deo. The writers I most admire all do this. They make the world new all over again. I divided this book into two sections. In the first, recounted Deo's memories, my words mostly, his memories entirely. This is a tale of survival, of despair and determination, evil and kindness. It's a story of a person not all that different from most of us, who through no act of his own is put in extraordinarily dangerous situations. The kind of story that might make you wonder, how would I have fared in his place? The second part of my book recounts my journeys with Deo back to the stations of his life in New York and in Rwanda and Burundi. It strikes me as mildly ironic that I decided to leave my New England neighborhood just when I had begun to feel too old, too fussy, too addicted to my comforts for Deo's kind of travel. By the time I went to Africa with him, I had very little appetite left for interminable plane rides, none at all for riding around in what I imagine were dangerous places. On one occasion in Burundi, I found myself so spooked that I asked Deo not to take me to a certain village. Actually, I demanded that he not take me there, which is a pretty odd thing for a journalist to do. In my defense, though, I have to say that I had some reason. Before we set out, he assured me that we would be very safe in Burundi. And then he said he didn't want me to take notes openly. I must never use the terms Hutu or Tutsi. And I should never speak the word genocide. And every so often, while we were driving around, he would say, of the drivers, "These people are crazy, they'll kill you for nothing." In part, I think this is a story about coming to terms with memory. That's why my book is structured as it is, the reason for its doubleness. The story I tell isn't only about memories I heard from Dale, but also about seeing him overtaken by memories again and again, acutely overtaken in several places, including places he hadn't seen since his escape 13 years before, the village where he was born and raised, and the hospital where he was nearly killed at the onset of the Civil War, and where his long travail began. I've read a number of stories by people who escaped genocide. Not all, but many make at least one assertion that I don't believe in, and that is, for me, as they say, everything is fine, just fine. And how, in fact, can a person deal with memories like Dale's? Tormenting memories, memories with a distinctly ungovernable quality, memories that come back in gusts. I think part of the partial answer that he found began to come to him while he was a student at Columbia. He majored in biochemistry there, and clearly not for practical reasons. He also majored in philosophy. And when I asked him why philosophy, he said, "I wanted to understand what had happened to me." Needless to say, he never quite got the answer. But Columbia was the place, I think, where his mind began to heal, if you'll allow me to use that overused word. But it wasn't the whole answer. Traveling with him in Burundi and Rwanda, I sometimes felt there was no answer. Our trip to that remnant of the hospital where his long escape began seemed as strange and dreadful as a nightmare, partly because when Dale entered the place, he went into something like a very angry trance, and I started to feel as though I was inside one of his nightmares, looking around at the cause of the nightmare. In Rwanda, there are many memorial sites, places full of the bones of the victims of the genocide of 1994. We visited many of those, including one mass graveyard from which Dale had narrowly escaped. And every one he wept. And in Burundi, men do not weep in public. One time he wept, as it were, by laughing raucously afterward, laughing over memories of hiding among corpses and wishing he were a bird, laughing at horror, laughing in a way that made me fear for his sanity for a moment, until I realized that this was another of the methods he used to preserve his sanity. Back when Dale was still trying to find his way around America, I'm sorry, I meant to say, but I think the main way he's done that is by acting. Back when he was still trying to find his way around America, he met Dr. Paul Farmer, who I know spoke here not so long ago, the great infectious disease doctor who had already spent a couple of decades trying to bring public health and modern medicine to some of the poorest people in the world. For a while, Dale worked for Farmer's organization, Partners in Health. He probably wouldn't like me saying this, but I think he became a protege of Farmer's in the sense that he was inspired by Farmer, and also in the sense that the works of Partners in Health taught him what was possible in a place like war-ravaged Burundi, and not only what could be done there, but also some of how to do it, and where to find people who knew how to do it and would help him do it, including Paul Farmer. By the time I met him, Dale had permanent residency status, and he was soon to become an American citizen. He didn't have to go back to Burundi. He could have lived a decent, even exemplary life in the United States, as many refugees have. Excuse me. No one could have blamed him if he'd stayed away from Burundi, where even now public health is, well, it's not quite non-existent, but it's truly deficient, and where hospitalized patients, this is still the case, who can't pay their bills are detained, imprisoned essentially, without food or care. But mainly because of those sorts of ills, Dale returned continually, and amid the post-war wreckage, with the help of his legions of friends and family, he created an organization called Village Healthworks, which has built a clinic, well really now a full-fledged medical facility, and a public health system, public health very broadly defined, which is free to those who can't pay. It's in a rural village called Kagutu. Building and staffing and supplying a clinic in a desperately poor country isn't easy. This clinic was a pile of rocks. Here it is. When I visited the site with Deo in the summer of 2006, by December 2007, it was providing food to the hungriest people in the area and clean water to all of them. And it was also a medical center, which now, in its 8th year of operation, has treated something on the order of 100,000 individual, different patients, some repeatedly, of course. And almost many of those anyway, for free. And the numbers are rising. They're now treating more than 20,000 a year. There was and still is nothing like this operation elsewhere in the country. People come there for help from all over Burundi, and some patients come on week-long treks from other countries too, from Tanzania and the Congo. Some visitors have come not for medical help, but only to see the facility. When Deo asked one of these travelers why he was there, the man replied, "To see America," which was pretty nice. In his widely publicized speech in Ghana some years back, President Obama imagined a partnership between the United States and Africa. Village HealthWorks, I think, is one small example, a model of American and African cooperation. This lofty vision of the President's embodied in miniature an instrument of peace. For Deo, I think creating Village HealthWorks has been a way to deal with memory. In the end, it's neither forgetting the past nor wallowing in the past that's worked for him. For him, the answer has been remembering and acting. It's also been the realization of an old dream, a dream of his youth, to build a clinic that would serve the kinds of people he grew up with, people rural, poor, to build, and it represents, I think, a kind of welding back together of his life that was torn in two by war. I think, like all true idealists, people who combine idealism with competence, he wanted to build something larger than himself. Burundi is a country that was ripped apart by largely artificial differences between two groups of people, differences that were exaggerated for the advantage of a few. Deo's inspired the beginning of an antidote, which focuses on something that unites all of us, our common vulnerability to illness and injury, our common hope for life. Personally, I've been very moved by this effort of his. When I visited Burundi with him, I saw any number of dismaying scenes. An elderly man, one of those essentially imprisoned at a hospital because he couldn't pay his bill, begging for food outside the hospital's nursery. And in the village where Deo planned to build the clinic, malnourished mothers and babies, youths and elders, dying for the lack of common, inexpensive medicines and of simple medical procedures. When we witness scenes like those, most of us, I think, tend to feel that we've incurred an obligation, at least to try to do something. It's a way of dealing with one's own discomfort, but sometimes the impulse can be useful to others as well. I remember visiting the site of the clinic back in 2006. I went with Deo and several of his American friends, several young doctors and medical students. A lot of the village, hundreds of people, had turned out to meet us. There were greetings, chants of amahoro, which means peace, and a speech from Deo, which the villagers cheered, and then speeches from the town's elders, of course, and then speeches from Deo's American friends, which Deo translated into Kirundi. And near the end of all this, he asked me if I wanted to say something, and of course I did. I always do, alas. I said, well, many people in your village are sick and you have no clinic. It's a terrible thing to be told that it will take time to build one, I said. But it will take time, I added. Looking out at all those faces, imagining them both skeptical and hopeful, I felt inspired, and I said, but I promise you that we will do everything we can to get this clinic built. As Deo translated my words, I thought they sounded pretty good in Kirundi, and then I thought the equivalent of oh dear, had it really been necessary to use the word promise. So I gave Village HealthWorks some money. It wasn't a great deal of money. I found a couple of others to give a little more, but it really wasn't a great sum of money. This wasn't hard to do, but it was enough to begin to appease my conscience and more important, obviously, to help get construction started. The fact is that getting something worthwhile done in a place like Burundi doesn't cost much in the way of money. Even now, or even back, coming out of hard times, I guess we really are just about out, we Americans have tremendous power to help purchase better lives for people in places like Burundi. What's required is that we invest wisely, not in self-serving aid organizations, but in groups like Village Health Works. And if you add a .org to that, you could look it up. This health system enjoys extraordinary support from its community, especially from the women of the community. That's very important for several reasons. One is that Burundi has historically been a very misogynist country. And also, because if you're interested in public health, you've got to pay attention to the health of mothers, obviously. And if you want to have economic growth, you've got to pay attention to the health of mothers. Anyway, at the moment, Village Healthworks is trying to raise the last money needed to build a women's health center, which will contain the first dedicated maternity ward the country has ever had. I want to read you a short passage from near the end of my book, and then I'll show you some pictures. This is some years ago now. Speaking at a fundraiser in New York, Adeo told this story. These are all his words. This past summer, we needed some help to make a road that goes to our site passable. A friend of mine told me, well, Deo, there's a great Belgian construction company that builds roads in Burundi and Rwanda and the Congo. And I was so excited, so I went to talk to the representative of the company. He sent someone to look at the road and estimated a cost at least $50,000 US. Not to pave the road, but just to widen it and make it passable. I went back frustrated, wondering how to tell the Kigutu community this bad news. As I was explaining this to them, one woman with a baby crying on her back said to me, "You will not pay a penny for this road. We become so much sick because we are poor, but we are not poor because we are lazy. We will work on this road with our own hands." The next day, 166 people showed up with pickaxes, hoes, machetes, and other tools. One of the volunteers was a woman who came to work with a sick child. When a friend of mine and I looked at the baby, we saw that the baby was sweating. I then asked the mother why she came to work with a child that sick, and she said to me, "Well, I've already lost 3 children, and I know this one is next, whether I stay at home or come to work here, so it's better for me to join others and make my contribution, which will help to save someone else's child who will be sick but alive when you have a clinic in Kigutu." The entire road, 6 kilometers long, was rebuilt by these people with machetes and hoes. The same day the road was finished, the representative of the Belgian road construction company called me to negotiate the price. You can imagine how I felt to get that call from him. I said to him, "Thank you so much for your call, but it's already done." He was obviously shocked and said to me, "What do you mean? Who did it? We are the only road construction company in the entire region." And I said, "Not anymore." So here he is. That's Deo in the red shirt. On the pile of rocks, and they were put in the wrong place. Had to be carried up to the right place later. Here's Burundi, just to give you a little sense. There's Rwanda, see, Congo and Tanzania, and Lake Tanganyika. This is just some quick facts, but I don't want to. And I refuse to read a slide to you, because I'm sure that's happened. Anyway, that bottom one is a very sobering statistic. This is an operating room in the biggest district hospital near Deo's facility. I apologize, but bad news first. This is a patient whom Deo encountered in Rwanda at a Partners in Health facility in a place called Rinkwavu. The American doctors who saw this child said, what in the world are these marks on his belly? And Deo knew right away what they were. This child had splenomegaly from enlarged spleen from repeated bouts of malaria, and it's very painful. It's an old habit, old custom in Burundi and in Rwanda, where they really didn't have anything else, any any other way of dealing with the child's pain, to heat a piece of metal in a fire and score the area around the painful area. Dale calls this distracting pain with pain. It has great philosophical importance for him. It's a hideous form of palliation, of course, but it's a poignant attempt to try to at least do something for people you love. Whoops. This is a woman who was actually detained when Dale met her at a hospital. He was visiting one of his first visits back, I took this picture. He had this idea that he would go back to the United States and raise the money to get all the patients released who were being detained, and then he realized, no, that was just going to make that detaining patients a more profitable enterprise. But he did bail this one out. And he had an appointment with the Minister of Health that afternoon, and he bailed her out and took her with him. The guard at the door, the security guard, said, "You can't bring her in here." She was clearly a peasant woman. And Dale said, "Oh no, this is the minister's aunt. The minister will be so happy to see her." He has some sunflower. Anyway, the minister was rather moved and did release a whole lot of patients that day, but they were all soon replaced. Efforts are still ongoing. Human Rights Watch has written about this. The new head of the World Bank is well aware of the problem, and so on. I'm going to go fairly fast through some of this so that there'll be time for questions. Here we are working, here they are, not me, at night in the early days of the clinic. Here, just in case you thought this wasn't true, here they are going to work on the road. This is one of the women working. More of that. This is what the site looked like initially when I first saw it. And here's a site, any of you who maybe work for the Peace Corps, or if you're going to work for the Peace Corps, you have this to look forward to. This is just classic. The kids of Kukutu. This is the first, and here is the first construction. Burundians are really famous for being diligent workers, and they're pretty good craftsmen too. This is the first of the clinic. This is the huge water tank that it's made in Germany, has its own internal filtration. The most powerful thing that you can do when you try to work on health in an impoverished country is to clean up sanitation, clean up the water supplies. Infant mortality rates would just plummet. That was the experience of Dr. Farmer in Haiti, and it's, I think, pretty much universal. Dale's very pleased with having the two flags there. And here are some of the people coming to get help. One of the things that war does, as I'm sure you can all imagine, civil war particularly, is it destroys cultural institutions, cultural habits, like the drumming of Burundi, which is practicing. They're really good. Here's the staff residence. It's already, you can see it's already overloaded. This was a gift of a generous American woman. It's 10 kilowatts of solar power. Was installed by an organization called the Solar Electric Light Fund, which is a nonprofit based, I believe, in Dallas. Here's Deo there's the president of Burundi, current president, and the U.S. ambassador. Another building was being built. Deo's in the middle with the stethoscope around his neck. Oh, here, I'm sorry. We saw those already. This is training of community health workers. This is the backbone of everything that Partners in Health has done in Haiti and in Russia and in various places in Africa and in Peru. And Deo's simply tried to transport this model to Burundi, to Kikuta. This is Paul Farmer's wife, unfortunately with her back to us, because she's quite wonderful to see from afar. Dee Dee Farmer. Now, don't tell me. Anyway, this is the pharmacy, but it's much enlarged now. Beginning to get internet technology, thanks to another donor. This is a picture Dale took. I just like the picture. And there's Dr. Farmer tending to one of the clinic's patients, a child with drug-resistant tuberculosis. They established a nice partnership with Columbia Medical School, sort of teaching situation. Women carrying water. And this is the big problem, one of the big problems. This fellow on the left is an American emergency medicine doc with his own thriving practice, but he's a great pal of Deo's, and he just decided to give up his practice for a year and come and be the medical director at the beginning of Village Health Works. He goes back there all the time, still. There's a little child who was burned, obviously, but healed. I don't understand what's wrong with my slides, but this is a man who was dying of AIDS, and you'll have to take it from me that he looked a lot better later. This is a child with tuberculosis, treated. These drugs do work. Same thing, but look at the results. It's quite wonderful. This is a child who was found abandoned, at least they thought he was abandoned, and someone brought him to the clinic, and the clinic essentially adopted him. He's malnourished. He's being examined here by the head Burundian doctor, and they treated him with the exotic medicine known as food. Here he is. And just in case you think that people abandon their children, these are women getting prenatal counseling, sorry, and vaccinations. There's early childhood schooling now, really working hard on education. If you want to put an end to civil war, you've got to have education. And they're trying to get some local industry going. This is important. A lot of agricultural practices fell into, or were degraded by the war. Everybody just started growing cassava. It's easy to grow, but it doesn't have much nutritional value. Village Health Works has brought in a lot of people to try to, they built demonstration gardens to try to help local farmers improve their practices, but they also have production gardens to raise the crops to feed the malnourished, because that is one of the big problems in their region. These are just some examples. Here's Deo getting a prize from the Dalai Lama. And this is a view of the lake from the clinic. It's very beautiful. It's the second deepest lake in the world. Gorgeous thing. Another one. And, oh, yet another. And here are the children of Kukutu. And this is the pitch, but I won't harangue you. But I would be glad to answer questions. If there's, I'm not sure I can see though. Maybe that. Oh, great. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering what insights you got, if any, looking through Dale's eyes on reconciliation and the promise of it. Yeah, I think
situation is probably different. I mean, I don't think there can be a formula for reconciliation. I think that's what you mean. His formula is, I'm going to build a clinic that it's situated as it happens, kind of midway between a place where there are many Tutsis and a place where there are even more Hutus. And I'm going to get them to work together. And I'm just going to try to make this happen by example. And I do remember being with him and seeing this work. He had been assigned a driver who was a former militiaman, who was just astonished when he saw what was going on. He said to Deo, he said, wait a minute, the people in this village are Hutus, you're a Tutsi, and you're building a medical clinic here for them? And Deo said, yeah. And I said, well, maybe I can help you. I mean, I realize, that there are other situations where there probably need to be peace and reconciliation commissions and so on, and I am not competent to comment on that. I don't think Deo has much of a position on it. I do know that most Burundians tend to feel, according to a scholar who really did the work, that they'd rather not have those commissions. What they'd really like is for their enemies to apologize to them. Of course, it's a bit of a problem since people on each side want the other to apologize, if you see what I mean. It's sort of like a bad marriage or something. But that's about all I know. I'm already over my head. Yes, ma'am?
And maybe you don't know this, but you mentioned how important clean water is in so many parts of the world. I heard that, is the Gates Foundation working on this? Are they just working on vaccinations?
The Gates Foundation has a huge fund for international health, which has made an enormous difference in the world. They do spend a great deal of their money on looking for better drugs and certainly on vaccination, which is very powerful. I don't know what they're doing about water, but they're an enlightened bunch, to be sure. And they also have got some dosh. Yes.
I have a question in terms of, as a writer and sort of someone who serves as a narrator to many people that don't know about these issues, where do you see sort of the balance in showcasing some of the negatives, like the diseases and the major negatives that many Americans in particular associate with Africa, with the positives and the industriousness? I work in global health and travel to Africa many times a year, including Rwanda and Burundi, and I'm constantly struck by, primarily by the things that they do have that we don't. And I wonder sort of how, as a writer, you balance that.
Well, I'm not sure that I do. Excuse me. I try to see the world as the people I'm writing about see it. And if you're really interested in public health, if that's your thing, the world that they confronted Deo in 2007, 2008 was pretty grim. But he's made it a lot better in one area. But that says nothing about the spirit of those people, their weariness with war, the entire awful history that's behind them, of Belgian colonialism. But if you're just focusing on public health, I think it would be a mistake to pretend that those problems weren't there. And I do think that the example that Deo has managed to set, and the clinic's far from perfect, the whole operation has had many problems, but I think the word is spread about this place. The president likes to brag on it. The U.S. ambassador likes to brag about it. And one hopes that the people of Burundi will begin to demand this sort of thing. After all, it's only the right thing to do. So, but I'm not sure I've answered your question. I don't set out to balance things that way. I'm not Fox News. I'm teasing. That was a bad joke. Sorry. It's been a lovely profession, I think. For me, I mean, I can't think of something of a better one. It feels like a privilege, really, to have been in the presence of some of these people. Most of the people I've written about. I can't say that. I mean, everything that happens to you or everything that you do changes your life in some way. I don't feel like my life has changed radically because I met Paul Farmer or Deo. I mean, I haven't given away all my worldly possessions. I haven't gone to work in Haiti or Burundi, where I'd only get in the way anyway. It does, however, I do feel that I learned something about the world that I didn't know before, particularly starting with Paul Farmer. I didn't know we were in quite as tough shape as we are. Just looking at the world through the lens of public health, it's pretty powerful. And I came to feel quite attached to that organization. I mean, I did I did some pretty careful work, I think, and I approached all of it with a skepticism that I developed over some decades of writing nonfiction. And I came away feeling that this was really more than legitimate, really a model of how things could be done. And so I pretty much signed on to do whatever Ophelia Dahl asked me to do. She's run PIH for years. And it's been nice, at 3 o'clock in the morning, to know that I'm trying to help. Basically, I've tried to help raise money, give talks. I don't know with how much success, but it's been very useful when I get fundraising calls from my alma mater, Harvard. And I can say, "What's the endowment now?" And and while I got you on the line, I'd like to talk to you about this. It's not quite fair to Harvard because they've made Paul Farmer a university professor, which I think there's 6 of them. It means he can do anything he wants. Usually you have to have a Nobel Prize to get one of those. But you get the idea. Yes, sir.
Given your experience, can you share your insights on the whole process of aid and aid with respect, particularly in terms of scale, the large, the small, the grassroots, and what's your sense of what works and what doesn't work?
I have 2 ways of answering that. But the first is to say that I don't think it'll ever work if it's not made to be indigenous. And that does not mean that we expect Haiti to have the wherewithal to produce antiretroviral medicines anytime soon, probably in my lifetime. That's not what I mean. But if you really want things to last, you build good infrastructure and you make sure that people who are being served are in on the game and that they know how to maintain that infrastructure. I mean, Partners in Health, I'd say about 99.5% of the staff regularly working in Haiti is Haitian. And I think that's good. I think that's the way it should be. When they built this enormous, beautiful new hospital in a place called Mirebalais, which is really a wonder, the job was bossed by a lovely guy from Boston who used to be head of Showman Construction, donating his time. But he made certain to do it the hard way, which was to make sure that Haitians were involved at every level of that construction. So I think that's crucial. As for scale, I remember a conversation with Farmer in Moscow. We'd been at dinner with a famous international figure in public health who Farmer was quarreling with during the day over whether or not tuberculosis patients should get some milk, extra milk. It was actually Frieden, the head of our CDC, good guy, but he was quarreling with him. And we'd had a little too much to drink at dinner. We were walking down a very, very cold Moscow street, Paul and I, scarves up around the but somewhat warmed at the same time. And I said something about, he said something about Frieden, and I said, he's interested in public health. All these people are interested in public health. And Paul said, well, I'm interested in public health too. He said, but who gets to say what the public is? Yeah. Is it an individual? Is it a family? Is it a village? Is it a city? Is it a country? And I realized, oh, okay, so this is the way the scale is supposed to go. You treat an individual, he begins to teach you, she begins to teach you how to treat the family, and so on. And I do think that that's, to a large degree, the way in which he has proceeded. He's also made sure, I think he's the smartest person I've ever known, he's also made sure to do what Deo has also done, which is to work with, one hopes, elected authorities, but if they're not elected, at least people who seem to represent the people, since you as an NGO don't represent anyone. And for instance, Partners in Health got started during the time of baby Doc Duvalier, not exactly the most savory companion. But they still managed to work with Ministry of Health people, and they've done that sort of consistently throughout. And Deo has done much the same thing, just always tried to involve the local authorities. Deo has more standing, of course, than most, being Burundian American. But I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's really important to think about that, about making things indigenous.
Tracy,
Yes.
is there help the last chapter, or is there another one?
Excuse me? What?
Is public health the last chapter, or is there another one?
Chapter for me?
Yep.
Oh, I actually have. I'm working on a book now that takes me back. It's not as important a subject, but it's taken me back to high tech, to the world of, well, really now software engineering. But it's only a brief visit, and perhaps I'll go back. I don't know where to go next. I'd like to spend considerably more time playing with my grandchildren, and but I want to keep writing. I just don't know about what. I got to finish this book first, though, or my grandchildren will have to support me. Thanks. What about it? Yeah. No, we have a lot of work to do. It's interesting. I'm told, I haven't seen this, but I'm told that if you go down to some of these mobile clinics that are sent to places, parts of the rural South particularly, thousands and thousands of people will line up to get some dental care. And I don't approve of that. I just don't approve of that. I think there are some basic, I'm with Paul Farmer on this, some basic basket of rights that all human beings have, just by virtue of being born on this planet. And in the end, it doesn't serve anyone's purposes to have an unhealthy population. In fact, it endangers all of us. And not just morally, but quite literally, I think. And we have a long way to go with public health in this country. We have the best medicine in the world, I'm sure. But we don't have the best public health, not by a long shot. And I think we ought to. And I know that we can. And I think it's every bit as important as doing this other work, but I think it's related. One of the most interesting things to me was about the work of Partners in Health early on was that they had imported to Boston, where there's plenty of medicine, probably too much, techniques they were using for treating AIDS and tuberculosis in Haiti, these community health workers. In Boston, you had AIDS patients repeatedly being rehospitalized at an enormous expense. It's not good for the patients. It certainly wasn't good for, the public coffers. And Partners in Health for a time, unfortunately, the project has lapsed, but had basically community health workers going out and making sure those patients were taking their medications on schedule, helping them do it. Anyway, this is a long story, but we could learn something from the ways things are done, the way things are done elsewhere, I think, in public health.
Did you evolve from the whole thing to the end, or did you just on site? I'm just curious about the narration that you're talking about, how much time you had to spend on site.
I was there the whole time. Maybe it might have been a few days I missed, but I was actually, when I started that project, I just become fascinated with home building. And I started out with a bunch of carpenters who interested me a lot. They were a curious collection of guys. And I thought I'd just write about their various jobs during a season of building in New England. And then this job came along, and it got more interesting. Suddenly there was a couple that needed a house built, and then an architect who needed to design one, and things got heated and more interesting. But I was there. What I really did love was being at the site and watching it. You know, among other things, it just smelled so good. Thank you.
Internationally, would you prevent our personal interests and prejudices from becoming like a new form of like neocolonialism?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer, but it's an important issue. Repeat the question. The question was, how do we prevent in international aid, how do we prevent our own interests from prevailing and creating, I think I have this right, a new form of colonialism? It's a huge issue, and it's with us even as I speak, as I understand it anyway. I mean, I think the biggest recipient of aid from USAID, the two biggest recipient countries are Israel and Egypt. And that, but I don't know how we prevent that. I don't. The whole subject is vexed, it seems to me. I do know people whom I respect, who feel that maybe we should just cut the whole thing out because we do more harm than good. I just can't buy that. Not when it's possible to do so much good if we do it right. But you know, the prescriptions that I would offer would be extremely naive, I'm sure. I wouldn't pass muster in the U.S. Congress for sure. You know, like saying, well, let's make sure that everything we do is in the interests of the people who should be receiving this money. I mean, we have some awful examples of in the past. I think USAID does a very good job sometimes, but there have been huge USAID projects where 50% of the money never left the Washington Beltway, you know, let alone got to people who needed it. I don't know that it's ever possible, though, to do these things apolitically, you know, without some stuff getting involved. But I do think it's a really important question. I hate to give you such a paltry answer. I hate it even more yesterday talking to high school students, answering roughly the same question in roughly the same way. Sorry.
Speaking do you have any insight on global inequality, and specifically insight that you might have in your position of kind of watching money flow to and forth? I mean, you're speaking a very wealthy county right now, and I'm wondering what kind of thoughts you have when you travel back and forth to these places about the people that you have the privilege to speak to here and the people you have the privilege to speak to there, and if that causes any, I don't know.
Dissonance in my head? Yeah, sure. But I can feel it, you know, I'm a writer, you know, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political theorist or any of those things, but I can feel the dissonance internally. I mean, I remember, you know, maybe a way to answer your question, if I may, it was to say that when I met Paul Farmer in 1994, and I knew pretty quickly that this was certainly someone worth following around. There was a good story here, in other words. And yet I didn't pursue him for 6 years. And I think the reason was Haiti. Haiti had shocked me, even though I'd been to Vietnam, and I'd never seen anything quite like it. And I knew, I had all of a sudden started to have a pretty nice, successful career. And what I really had become convinced of was that I, had earned all my privileges. And the problem with taking an idea like that to a place like Haiti is that it vanishes, just crumbles the moment you ask yourself the simple question, well, what if I had been born a Haitian peasant? What would my privileges look like now? And I just knew that if I started following this guy around, he was going to disturb my peace of mind. And he did. this is all sort of pitched at a very personal level, but I do think that we are far more alike than not, we human beings, and that it's we simply can't allow ourselves to be defined entirely by our material circumstances. It's really easy to do if you're up on top to do that, and I've caught myself doing it any number of times. But I hope, to do better tomorrow. I can't see. Oh, yes.
Dale was a classmate of mine. He was never someone who really spoke about himself very much. And I'm just curious how you were able to help him open up to you, especially about the more traumatic.
It was difficult. I remember I don't know if you heard the question. How did I get Dale to open up to me? I was persistent, I guess. It took him a long time to decide to give me the access to do this. And I waited patiently. And at a certain point, I remember writing to him rather carefully, saying, look, I just have to move on here. And you can say no, but I do need to know. You can say no, and it won't affect the way I feel about you at all, or anything else. And he decided to let me do it. There were a couple of times when I offered to stop. Almost a year in at one point, it just seemed too difficult for him. And he said no, to keep going. So, traveling with a person to a foreign country, particularly to his country, and to Rwanda, changes the equations quite a bit. Suddenly, he's the guy in charge, and I think that made a difference. In fact, I remember when we landed in Bujumbura, I was really tired, and all our bags, where are our bags? It's the usual chaos of Burundian airport. Not that there are many, but anyway, Dale suddenly is in charge, and he had his bush hat on, and he was getting the bags and everything. And I remember thinking, and I guess I wrote it, that he all of a sudden had become a size larger to me. I got to know him, I got to know his family eventually, very well, actually. But it's sort of my job. And I don't have a formula for it except just staying there and trying to be a good guest in a person's life.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
What about Ebola? What can be done about Ebola? I know Ebola did not come to Burundi, but what if it had?
What if it had? Oh, God. Would have been terrible. Burundi doesn't have the facilities to deal with it, nor, of course, did Sierra Leone or, Guinea and Liberia. What about, I have a dear friend who's actually been running the whole Partners in Health operation in Sierra Leone. And I think they've done a very good job. But one of the things that's been demonstrated is that this is not a disease that necessarily has to kill 90% of all the people who get it. It's a very bad disease, though. It's nasty, lethal. But it does illustrate very, very clearly how impoverished the poor countries of the earth are in medical facilities. And the only answer to it is improving public health, internationally, I think. This is not the only huge plague we're going to face. It might even be one of the least horrifying in the end. Think about AIDS. Ebola does tend to burn itself out in hideous ways, of course. I don't know. I'm no expert on Ebola. I've heard Farmer talk about it, and he'd be a much better person to ask. I'm sorry. Thanks very much.